What's going on, guys? This is Rob, and we are back. I'm back from my little vacation out to Cincinnati and Lexington, Kentucky to see my sister for her birthday, which was really, really cool. So let's record some audio and cover some stories. So we're picking back up again with Spider-Man. Honestly, I want to kind of get to the end of Worldwide, and then we might go into Nick Spencer's run. Honestly, I love Nick Spencer's Spider-Man run. It's one of my secret favorite comics that I read that I just don't really cover here on the channel, which as a comic book YouTuber, you need those, right? You need the stories that you just don't cover. You just read them for the sake of your own personal enjoyment. Otherwise, it feels like it stops being enjoyable. Having said that, there's a couple things to know here. I'd been hunting through my YouTube channel because I was so sure that we covered the Fall of Parker storyline, which is part of Marvel Legacy, and it turned out that we did, right? So the big thing to really come out of the Fall of Parker was basically the collapse of Parker Industries, right? The last video that we did, Peter Parker was the CEO of just like this massive Parker Industries corporation, which had initially been launched by Superior Spider-Man when Dr. Octopus was in the body of Peter Parker, and that going into All New, All Different Marvel, Peter had gotten his body back and was now the CEO. This all basically concluded in the Secret Empire event, which we might add to the Spider-Man playlist just to kind of make it make sense as far as transitioning goes. Otherwise, you just kind of jump and like there's all these huge changes. The idea behind this was that because Captain America's history had been changed by the Red Skull using a cosmic cube to make Captain America into a Hydra agent, that the biggest concern, or one of the big concerns, is that given everything he'd done as a kind of focal point of the superhero community, knowing everybody's weaknesses and so on, is that by blocking superheroes from getting to Earth, right, the heavy hitters like Carol Danvers or Hyperion or anybody like that, keeping them out of the fray, and then basically conquering North America, if he got his hands on Parker Industries tech, that it would have allowed him to expand his reach in a way that just simply wasn't possible at the time, and then ultimately conquer the world most likely. And so in order to prevent that from happening, Peter Parker quite literally torched his own company. He basically ended up tanking Parker Industries, destroyed all his technology and everything to make sure Captain America couldn't get his hands on it. The good side of this is that it saved countless people from the crazy machinations of Captain America. The downside is that it killed Parker Industries as a company, and Peter Parker screwed over a lot of folks, right? A lot of people got left hanging. People's entire pensions were tied up in Parker Industries. People had investments, people worked for the company. So millions and millions of people in one form or another across the world basically lost everything as a result of Peter destroying his own company. And so that's why at this point in the Spider-Man mythos under Dan Slott's run, it's an opposite of what it used to be. That Spider-Man was always kind of considered the menace by like, the Daily Bugle, and that Peter Parker was like the kid who was just kind of there and doing some cool stuff and people more or less liked him. It was the opposite, that Peter Parker was considered the menace and Spider-Man was hailed as the hero, right? So it offered a kind of cool psychological take on the nature of Spider-Man, in the sense that Peter had to contend with the idea that people hated him as a person, but they loved Spider-Man. But one of the big things that goes on here is that you actually end up having this kind of scenario where you're introduced to something that's basically called the lockbox. Now, the lockbox is kind of a submersible. It's almost like the Raft in Marvel Comics. Those of you guys who don't know, the Raft is a prison for superpowered villains, right? The lockbox is a kind of prison or a holding place for super powerful artifacts, right? So things like the Casket of Ancient Winners and so on and so forth. The big kicker behind all this is that those individuals who basically kind of sent out to grab these artifacts that are basically taken to the lockbox are not necessarily told what they are. And a lot of this is done for the purpose of making sure that like their desires don't really get the better of them, because it's kind of a 50-50 guess, right? And in all honesty, it's one half dependent on the loyalty of the people who work there, that they don't ask questions and they do that because they're told to, and the other half, fear. They're afraid that what they might do is open the box and unleash a deadly plague across the whole world and kill everybody. And so because of this, what you actually end up having is a couple people named Crane and Coleman. And what ends up going on is that as Crane and Coleman are bringing this artifact into the lockbox, suddenly like they start getting these kind of fluctuations from a device that's held in a containment cell that's known as Containment Cell 12. Now, this turns out to be the Zodiac Key. This is not an overly important thing. And that's one of the things we're going to kind of do here is there's not a lot of stuff that's super important here. It's more of like what happens at the back of the stories, and you'll see why that's so important as we get to it. But the Zodiac Key was basically a device that has existed for a long time in Marvel Comics. It originally hailed from a place called the Ankh dimension, which was basically a dimension where the key itself kind of existed to maintain the conflict between good and evil. It eventually arrived on Earth, and it's been used by various people, but it kind of has a mind of its own, right? So if you're a person who picks up the Zodiac Key and you're like, I want to end all conflict between good and evil, and I want the world to be a utopia, the key will leave you, right? And it'll go to somebody else, because the desire of the key is to instigate conflict. It's basically social media in a physical form, and so because of that, the key itself was at one point really possessed by a guy named Vernon Fury, who of course is basically descended from the original Nick Fury. He was a guy that operated under the mantle of Scorpio. We covered that in the early Spider-Man runs from All New, All Different Marvel by Dan Slott. The important thing is he was basically pushed into a vault by Peter Parker, which was essentially the Zodiac Vault. He gained a year's worth of knowledge about all the things that are going to happen within a year in the future, and then basically is being freed from the vault at the moment, right? So it's not an important thing, like a great big huge fight ensues between Peter and Vernon, and then basically Vernon's arrested, right? I mean, there's not a whole lot to go there. I mean, the meat and potatoes of this, right? Like the real important thing about this is that Vernon is really intending to use like the satellite systems of the world to essentially dump the world's secrets out there for everybody to see, because what it'll do is that'll create conflict, right? People realizing like their best friend's been sleeping with their wife, right? Or like people realizing their boss is like cheating them out of pay or something along those lines, whatever the case happens to be, right? But like all the secrets that everybody has around the world, which are largely kept in the digital space, are going to be dumped out there for the world to see. The important thing about all this, the most important thing here is Coleman and Crane, because while they're all kind of there, while they're inside the lockbox, they're actually on a mission of their own, traveling from one location to the next, trying to access a particular cell. And the big thing is that as they come across different soldiers of the lockbox, they basically kill them, right? They spray them down. And it's just like, we're here for a mission of our own. And that's kind of the crazy thing, is because when they're confronted by the leader of the lockbox, it's like, why are you doing this? Like your whole background was checked multiple times. And their response is, but here's the thing, we work for a guy who pays more than you do. So sure, we have a clean background, you just didn't pay enough money, right? That's the thing about hired guns, right? Like their loyalty is to whoever pays the most. That's the dangerous game you play. So if you're a government worker, as anybody says, the government pays cheap. And so when you buy cheap, you get cheap. And that's basically how things went down here. Now, as for Vernon himself, of course, Spider-Man traces him down or locates him at Big Ben, which was a place where previously his organization had basically created a kind of resonance device that the key could tap into and then use that to access the satellites, right? So it's like if the satellites speak French and the Zodiac speaks Spanish, this whole Big Ben key system is a translator, is basically what it is. And so Peter Parker is really unable to get it out, but then comes to this realization that previously the key responded to Vernon because he needed it, right? That the key and Vernon are kind of in tune with each other because Vernon basically stands the best possible chance of allowing the key to achieve its goal, which is basically creating conflict and all kinds of massive issues, right? This massive battle between good and evil on a physical and even a philosophical level. And so the key responds to him. And so what Peter Parker does is pretty shady here. Peter Parker knocks this guy out of Big Ben. Literally sends this guy like flying through the glass on the front plate, and Vernon's just falling to his death. The key leaves its position and responds to Vernon, which of course prevents the key from being able to access the satellite systems, dumping their information into the world. And then in turn, of course, Vernon's basically snatched up by a combination of Mockingbird and the cops, right? He's knocked unconscious and he's taken to jail, and that's the end of that, right? That's what a lot of this stuff is. And so what you end up finding out here is the mission that Coleman and Crane were sent on was paid for by Norman Osborn. And what he was trying to do, and what he's been trying to do, is find a way to become the Green Goblin again. Ever since he was given the cure to the Goblin formula during Superior Spider-Man and lost his ability to become the Green Goblin, it's like a drug addiction, right? He's always trying to find a way back, always trying to get this Goblin back, because it's just part and parcel to who he is. And so ultimately, you end up finding out the artifact that Coleman and Crane had attained was a portion of the Carnage symbiote. That what Norman Osborn's trying to do is regain his ability to become the Green Goblin by merging with Carnage. Now, a lot of the reason for this is because in the eyes of Norman Osborn, Carnage represents just chaos in the most visceral way, right? Just chaos and pandemonium. And in a lot of ways, Carnage and the Green Goblin were very similar in terms of their personalities, right? That they were basically insane. They love to inflict harm, so on and so forth. The big difference between Carnage and Green Goblin is Green Goblin's insanity and his motivations to, commit all kinds of heinous crimes were usually targeted towards Spider-Man. With Carnage, it's everybody, right? Like, it's just like if he could drive the world into total insanity and kill everybody there, then he would, right? There's no real instance where Carnage hates Spider-Man in particular. He more often than not was a Spider-Man villain, but that's because he gained his original prominence fighting Spider-Man and Venom. The reason why Carnage is so prominent now is because he's not just a Spider-Man villain anymore. That he's one of these guys where he could pop up and face off against virtually anybody, and any number of things could happen. It's one of the things that makes him so cool. But again, there's a few other things that go on here. The important thing is that with Norman Osborn in possession of the Carnage symbiote, this is one of those instances where it's the monkey's paw, law, right? Be careful what you wish for, you just might get it. And that's exactly what happens here. Norman Osborn does not understand the very nature of what the Carnage symbiote represents. And a lot of that's because he hasn't had any real dealings with it before. If this was Peter Parker who was here and Norman Osborn was getting ready to bond to the Carnage symbiote, Peter Parker would say, do not do that. You don't know what, like, you have no idea what you're getting into bonding to the Carnage symbiote. But at the end of the day, Norman Osborn sees the symbiote as something that can be dominated, something that can be controlled. And the reason why is his only real understanding about the symbiotes comes from Venom. But Venom and Carnage are distinctly different. That the Venom symbiote is a symbiote that bonds itself to Eddie Brock, and they kind of work in unison because initially they both had a hatred for Peter Parker. A lot of that's changed over the years in terms of the role that Venom has played with regards to how it views itself, how it views Peter, the fact that in like the current day and age, Eddie Brock is actually a good guy, but the Carnage symbiote's a whole different beast. That the Carnage symbiote has a will of its own in a far more intense way than Venom does. And that's why as soon as the symbiote starts to bond itself to Norman Osborn's like, no, he doesn't want to have anything to do with it. He's like, I want an empire, right? I want to rule things. And Carnage's like, no, we're gonna kill everybody, right? Like literally the will of Carnage dominates the will of Norman Osborn, to the point that Norman Osborn is almost a passenger seat in his own life with the Carnage symbiote in possession of him. And that's what makes things so crazy, is because the power of Carnage in comparison to what Norman Osborn is used to, it's on a whole different level, right? That the Green Goblin did kind of have its own personality to a degree. There was actually a point where the Green Goblin and Norman Osborn were two distinctly different people, but even the personal drives and motivations of the Green Goblin as its own entity were nothing on par with regards to what Carnage has, insofar as having a will of its own and being able to dominate the will of others. But that's one of the things that makes Norman Osborn so unique, is because even in the most insane situations, in this part like this, where he would normally be completely and totally overcome by the will of Carnage, Norman Osborn is nothing if not a master manipulator. And depending on who you're talking to, you could even consider him a demagogue. But the important thing here is that where Carnage just ends up killing Coleman and Crane, the response of Norman Osborn is, I can give you more of this. I can give you more of this desire, of this satisfaction that comes with just destroying people, right? Killing them, so on and so forth. And so Carnage's like, yes, give me more. I want more of this, right? I miss this feeling of taking lives and so on. And that's when Norman says, okay, fine, I will give you that, but only on one condition. I am in the driver's seat. I'm the one who's in control. Show me you understand. And the Carnage symbiote responds by saying like, I understand. And Norman's like, okay, cool. And that's what kind of brings Norman back in control, because the response of this is like, you know what? Let's try something else, right? Let's try something that we haven't done before. Let's try something interesting. He says, we can be greater than this. Yes, I have this Carnage symbiote, which is more than enough to take out Peter Parker, but what if we switch things up, right? I can become the Goblin again. I can become something more. We can become something more. And so what he ends up doing is basically breaking out the Goblin formula that he kept on him, right? Remember, he got that formula back. He has a Goblin formula on him, and then in turn consumes it. And so what you're going to end up having here is the Green Goblin and Carnage merging into a singular being, and things get crazy. With that being said, guys, we're going to bring this to an end. Thank you guys for watching, and I will catch you all later. Peace.